Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Don Falgout.
And I am your ghost host, Stephen Falgu. Boo. That's all I'm allowed to say. Legally, I'm only allowed to say boo for the rest of the podcast.
That's in the contract that we negotiated.
With Halloween, the holiday. We negotiate a contract with the holiday.
Yeah, it's a blood pact.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what makes it scary. Actually, that's why the screen is red.
Yeah, that's the pact of blood at the top, and then the bottom is the coagulated blood.
You know in video games, like when like first person shooter games, you get shot, there's like blood on your screen. That's kind of like what's
that's
going
actually
on.
actively happening to us right now.
Yeah, I'm struggling to see.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, that's what being a ghost is like, because it's like constantly like you're looking through just a screen of blood. It's really scary.
So, like, no matter how you died, you have to look through a screen of blood.
Yeah,
in the afterlife.
It doesn't matter.
Wow. Okay. That sucks for ghosts.
Oh yeah.
Speaking of ghosts, do we have any friends that might be joining us today? On our podcast?
Well, here's the thing. I sent out all the invites, and nobody got back to me. I think they all have some kind of like grudge.
Yeah.
Like that. Like
they were at the Monster Mash, I heard.
Mm-hmm.
That sucks. I mean, it happens every year, so we should have anticipated that it would happen today. But I mean, sometimes scheduling it just doesn't work out like that. You just gotta hope some people will defer.
Yeah, it's really odd because like you'd think that all the creeps and ghouls would be totally open on Halloween. I mean, it's like the one day where they're all available, because for the rest of the year they're in their graves.
Yeah, and it's like I was also working in my lab late one night. It's like they're not special over there. Like they could come over here.
Yeah, we got a lab.
Yeah, we're not afraid of no ghosts, is what I'll say. And yet they don't come to us. They don't hang out with us ever.
I mean, in fairness, I think the reason that we're not afraid of no ghosts is that we are ghosts.
Yeah, well, that does help. I think it would be quite weird, I guess, if we were ghosts and afraid of ghosts. It would be like the fear of going outside or seeing other people.
Which is something that some people do have.
Yeah.
So maybe there are some like maybe that's why ghosts stay in the same house forever.
Oh,
they're just agoraphobic.
Ghostophobics.
Oh my god. Well, speaking of ghostophobics, why don't we get into what I recommended to you, Stephen?
A beautiful segue as always.
And that was hold on a sec. Stephen, are you there? Where am I? Where am I? What? Oh my god! Oh my god!
Oh, hey, there I am.
Oh no, my vision is nothing but a screen of blood. Oh my god, I'm a ghost too!
Oh, there you are.
It disturbs me that you're not surprised by this.
Well, that's us. So, like, we're just looking at ourselves in the mirror right now.
That's a good point. Yeah, I'm actually reflected off of my computer monitor, and I'm capturing it through EVP, which I think is the audio recording thing, but it's a video recording now.
Well, what's the one where you got to see if it's cold, and then if it's cold, there's a ghost there?
That's
a temperature gauge,
a thermometer. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cold in this podcast right now because we're ghosts. Well, we're chilling it up.
Now that we've made it cold, I think our friends are starting to show up. We've got Billy, we've got Mallory's, we've got Ashley and Zoe. Unfortunately, again, everybody else is a little busy at the Monster Mash. Well, hold on. I think I just heard my window break. Oh
Oh,
my god, it's
oh,
Gary! Oh my god, Gary! You should really watch where you're throwing that thing.
sliding right into our DMs like always. Look at him go.
He's not the smoothest. He's not the smoothest.
No, but I would like to point out that he is throwing that slider right to the title of what you recommended to me, which was Saw, 2004's Saw. It's been a long time since I've seen this one. I remember one time I did like a movie marathon with all the Saws, and I seem to remember them being much more like to the point and like just straight gore fests. So I was surprised when I was going back and watching this one how much it was story driven. This Saw felt more to me like a thriller film than the gore film that I remembered them being. Not to say that there weren't gory moments. Um, some very famous scenes in a bathroom, but for the most part, from what I remember Saw being, it's a lot of different game traps that require people to escape. This was so very focused on the one setup, which was the Dr. Lawrence, I think,
Dr.
and Adam.
Gordon. Dr.
Doc-
Gordon.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gordon and Adam in the bathroom. And then everything around it was kind of interstitials of past events on either of their lives or on the group of detectives that are trying to hunt down the murderer known as Jigsaw. Can I just talk about Jigsaw for a second? I love that he has a little puppet that rides on a tricycle.
He's a little cute guy. He's
He's
just
just
a
a
little
little
guy.
guy. He loves riding on his tricycle. And can you blame him? It's a nice tricycle. And he always wants to play a game, which I mean, I get that.
Oh yeah,
I think
games are a lot of fun. Games are really
Gary
fun.
gets that. Look at him. He's always playing a game. Just pitching constantly.
Always playing the ball game.
Mm-hmm. I think what surprised me the most about Saw, the first Saw, this Saw, is that it was like so story driven, and it was like a thriller and a little bit of a mystery. Definitely had a couple twists and turns throughout. You as the audience are trying to figure out who the Jigsaw killer is at the same time as trying to understand the psyche of the two individuals in the bathroom as one is given the directive to kill the other to save his family, and they have to kind of work together in this gruesome escape room to get out before the clock ticks down or meet the objective of murdering the other. And also, I was surprised that Donald Glover's in this movie, considering
Yeah.
this was a pretty indie film. But I guess at that time, Donald Glover was kind of doing anything. And I guess he just sort of stumbled into what became a gigantic box office smash here. It's funny because I feel like a lot of times we don't typically recommend the big boys. I mean, we have in the past, like your Shinings and such. I feel like a lot of times we're recommending indie films that kind of became smash hits, like Saw, like House, like Blair Witch Project. So to see that happen here again. Now, I would say this one definitely felt like, even as an indie film, it had a much larger budget than some of the other ones we've seen, for sure. And also, the other thing I would mention as I was watching this is it felt very early 2000s. Like, especially in some of the, I don't know, like flash cuts that they would do of like people screaming or whatever.
Oh,
Some,
and the Matrix inspired color correction.
yep, for sure. I saw all that and I was like, wow, I definitely am being taken back to a very specific time in film history.
It's
I'll say to wrap up just these initial thoughts on it, I think what makes it so compelling is that there is all of those little moments that you can hold on to. I mean, there's the horror element of just the actual concept of what's going on, the thrill of what are these characters going to do, and then also that kind of story through line that pushes the whole thing forward, both getting a like a bigger dig into both of their psyches, the two characters in the room, but and also like what would be their motivation for both being there and for wanting to, doing whatever it takes to get out. But then following that mystery around Jigsaw too is very interesting because you kind of get an idea of what they are about as well.
Yeah, I think like your memory of the series being a marathon you did explains why you thought of the movies the way that you did. I also have just recently gone through all of them up to the seventh one. Um, they're the worst. They're terrible. It's not even just like, oh, they're gory and graphic. I can handle that. I've seen worse, but they're just very poorly made. And even this one is heavily flawed, but the big difference is that there's a lot more focus, so the movie's like cleverness actually kind of works. I would say of all the Saw films, this is the only one that's actually smart. All the other ones do a whole lot to convince you they're smart and convince you, like, I swear, there's more to this movie than like people gouging their eyes out and stuff, but there really isn't. Like, every movie follows the same format of the first one, which is that there's like an A or B plot, depending on which movie it is, of people in a trap or in a series of traps, and then the police trying to either get them out or figure out who Jigsaw is, or both. Um, and it's always it gets really absurd in the later movies, but it in this film everything ties up pretty well. I think there's also a really good pace between the two stories. Like, you don't ever feel like you're wanting more screen time from one or the other. They do a really good job of keeping a consistent balance between the two, and also it's like because the main trap takes place in this one bathroom. It's nice to get breaks from that. I feel like that environment stays filthy and unpleasant throughout the whole movie because you never get enough time to look at it to where you just kind of get used to it. And I think the thing is like a big part of the reason why the movie has a certain reputation is I think that there weren't popular movies quite like it. I mean, you have things like Cube and stuff. As far as like this like thriller format that they do here, it's not the most original thing ever, but the whole idea of like these death traps and these death games just kind of puts an idea in your head even if the movie doesn't really show a lot. I know critics at the time did not like this movie, and they were already calling it things like torture porn or whatever, which is really funny in retrospect, especially knowing what other films inspired by this and the series itself turned into just after like the first one. Um, because like as you said, you don't see much. In fact, you really almost see nothing. I think there's like maybe two or three scenes where you even see blood coming out of a person in real time. I mean, there's like a corpse on the ground with blood the whole movie, but other than that, like they really don't show much. And a lot of that is a result of budget, but I think it's also just like an intentional choice. It makes a lot of the scenes feel more grotesque because it's left to the imagination. I mean, sure, like in later movies where, people are like cutting off chunks of flesh directly on screen, it's definitely more immediately gross, but I like how this movie forces you to think about it a little bit more. Even in the infamous scene involving the saw, you only really see the cutting for like a second. Um, but yeah, I think that reputation is kind of funny. I think it's something that makes watching this movie interesting because you're kind of like, oh wow, I actually appreciate that it's really not that balls to the wall. It's pretty subtle as far as this concept goes. It certainly could have shown a lot more, and the choice to not actually serves it pretty well.
Yeah, the other thing I would say about this one is definitely the death traps feel less involved, but I don't think that's to the film's detriment. I think that as this season or as the series goes on, the death traps get more intricate, but I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. I think especially the primary death trap, there are a few that you see typically more after the fact than during, although there are a couple. The primary one is the two characters in the one room, which is just such like that whole environment, the concept of that trap, the like just the framing of the shots within that area is just so good. I mean, that alone is such an iconic event. That the bathroom scene, like any scene where they're in the bathroom and everything that's going on within that really helps, I think, elevate the whole film versus where I feel like a lot of the later films just kind of try to live off of the death trap and not necessarily use it as it's almost it like in this movie it's its own theme. Truly, like the bathroom is a theme within the film. The griminess of it, like how the characters are a reflection of what's going on. Later it's just like people's heads getting blown off and like goring their own eyes out to find a key under their eyeball or whatever.
Right, yeah, and I also like, the trend of using multiple traps did start with this one, but the later movies kinda take it in another way. Like, in this movie, there's only 1 trap going on in real time, but in the other movies, it'll be, like, multiple ones or whatever. In this movie, you see the other traps through flashbacks, and I really like that choice as well. Like, that does a good job, like, establishing the context of Jigsaw and what he does. I think the scene with the most one of the most famous scenes with the reverse bear trap is really well done, from a story perspective. Like, when the cops are interrogating Amanda, who was, like, a previous victim of Jigsaw, but she was a survivor. That does a really good job showing the effect of what Jigsaw does and helping you understand that, okay, this is like a killer who people in this area are very familiar with. And I also another thing about this movie, and it sucks to talk about the sequels so much, but they've been on my mind. A lot of the sequels try to turn Jigsaw into, first of all, like just a Machiavellian supervillain. Like the level of intellectual genius that this man possesses is unbelievable. Even after the guy dies, he's basically plotting events from beyond the grave. It's insane. And they also try to make him like a moral figure that like what he does is ethical and even kind of good. But like in this movie, while he does have a system of ethics, it's like really stupid and reprehensible. He's putting people in traps because they were depressed or like were junkies. And it's like, oh, like, well, after you get out of this one, you're going to really appreciate your life. So that's like, I feel like that code of ethics is just something to make him seem even more threatening and terrible. You're like, wow, it's crazy that somebody who thinks their head is in the right place could do such heinous acts. And I like that that element is here for Jigsaw. It makes him more actually scary as opposed to in the later movies where they're really just trying to make him an icon of horror. And it's kind of like pathetic the lengths that they go to do that. I don't really think I think this movie tried as well with like the puppet and stuff, and it worked and it was enough. You know, I like his motivation, but I do still think there are moments in this movie where it feels like he's a little too smart. All of these movies have the problem where like the second you start thinking about the twist, you're like, okay, but if like one thing happened to go away that he didn't want, whether it be with the cops or the people in this trap, then everything would be different. And it's not as bad in this one as in later ones, but it's still a little funky.
Yeah, well, especially when you consider the end of the film, and I'm sure we'll get there in a minute here. But I agree. I think that, there's still some moments, like for instance, he gets shot and he kind of walks it off. You're like, okay, I guess that could happen. And there are some things like that where it's like, there are definitely elements of them trying to make this person seem superhuman, but it still feels grounded enough to where it's believable.
It definitely doesn't go too far. Like after seeing the later ones, I think if I went back and watched this right now, I would feel like it was completely realistic in every way. So
So one of the things I will mention about this film though is like there isn't really a happy ending. I mean, honestly, for anyone who's escaped, there isn't really a happy ending, although maybe Amanda has it best, but even she's quite scarred from the experience, like both emotionally and physically scarred. And obviously, um, by the end, one of the characters escapes, and I wouldn't call it a happy ending. And I think what this film does really well is it doesn't necessarily subvert the expectation that there will be a happy ending or that the killer will be caught. But certainly in a lot of situations, it builds up tension in the fact that there are moments where if things would have gone slightly differently, everything probably would have turned out for the better, but instead they turn out for the worse. Now, I wouldn't say, back in 2002, 2003 when they're filming this, do I think that they thought that this film was going to be this like mega juggernaut of a franchise? Maybe, probably not. But that they were able to create tension naturally in so much that, the killer kind of gets away by the end and everything. And even one of our quote unquote heroes really doesn't really have a happy ending at all. I think helps the film as well. So I think instead of just talking around it, we can just talk about the finale. So I guess spoilers if you've never seen Saw. But by the end, the whole thing is they give both of the characters a saw. The characters believe the saw is to be used for the chain, but then they learn, no, maybe we should just cut off our feet. After the doctor gets a few calls from his family and learns that they aren't really safe, he decides to finally do it. And then also shoot his counterpart, which is the way that he was supposed to win the game. Now, I think it is. So it's set up earlier in the film that they try to like fake one of their deaths. I think in this case, it maybe is kind of implied that that might have been the case again, but I'm not so sure. But by the end of it, who they think to be Jigsaw ends up in the room and tries to kill them because they ran out of time. But the one in Adam, who we thought was dead, actually is alive and is able to wrangle the gun and take him out with the toilet seat bowl. Gordon's able to escape and says, I'll come back for you. And then we learn that the guy who's been dead the whole time in the center of the room was Jigsaw all along. He wasn't dead at all. He was just chilling.
just laying
Really,
face down on the
yeah.
bathroom floor for hours.
I don't really know why. I don't think he needed to be doing that, but he did. And then he's like, hey, it was me, bitch. And he walks out.
And I
And
think
he closes the door.
I think it's a cool twist because like one,
Yeah, I do.
it's genuinely pretty surprising. I also think that a lot of the ties that it wraps up throughout the movie, like it's like, oh wow, that was actually pretty well constructed.
Yeah.
The way that
And I
like
guess
it
I
kept you
should
guessing.
mention, to help the twist, the person who kind of stumbles in the room and tries to take both of them out, we as a viewer at that point think that that is the Jigsaw killer. And it turns out, no, he himself was in his own game trying to take out an antidote from a poison that the real Jigsaw killer put in his body.
I also like the music helps a lot here. very famous theme song from this series, I think, because they use it, I think, for the first time in this movie during the twist, and it kind of becomes like a series staple to use that music whenever a twist is being revealed. But it's pretty effective. It definitely makes the whole thing feel bigger. You end the movie like, holy shit, that's crazy. Um, and like, unfortunately, that trick ran dry immediately because they do it in every single movie, and it's dumber and dumber every time. And as I said, I think even here, there's aspects of it that are a little fishy, but like it holds together. I think like by the end, you're not really left questioning the twist and being like, that makes no sense or that's stupid. You're just kind of like, huh, that was pretty smart, which is probably due to the fact that, this is not supposed to be the first movie in a series. It's just its own movie. So they were able to write everything and write all the characters and all the story scenes and everything in a way that would make this twist work, that would work toward the twist and build toward it. And the whole thing feels pretty self-contained in the end. Like even that final moment he closes the door and everything, it's just like, ooh, that was powerful.
Yeah, and I agree. I do think it's a good twist. It really makes the whole thing feel very fun. Like I mentioned, it not only is this a thriller, but it's almost a mystery film as well, trying to unravel, who is the Jigsaw killer. I think at different points in the film, we as the audience could believe it to be a few people, like the down on their luck detective who might have taken up the mantle, the character that ends up being the captor of the doctor's wife and kid, and then when it kind of gets revealed at the end and they have a little flash cut of like all the things that he said or you might have seen along the way. It's a fun little twist, and I think what I would say about the whole film is it's just an enjoyable thriller film, horror film to watch. It's not very long either. I think that helps it. I think if it were longer, it would start to overstay its welcome. But to your point, I think what also makes it so enjoyable is, and this is not something I say a lot about films, but actually having those cuts to prior events to kind of break up what is the primary action and like the primary theme of like this grotesqueness, this gore really does help it kind of move along, and it gives you mental breaks throughout the thrill experience that really help. But all in all, a very good film. I know we talked about the sequels a lot, but I definitely remember, again, it's been a long time, but I remember they start to get very schlocky. They just start to go overboard with a lot of the gore and everything. I think this film finds a nice balance. I think it could have gone pushed itself a little further to what you mentioned, like a lot of it is kind of like off screen. And maybe that helps it and doesn't help it, but I think for what I mean, clearly what they were going for is more of the thrill of it all than the actual like sight of it. But definitely, but what I would say there is like I'd be curious, if they had more budget or knowing what they know now about the series, would they have shown more? Considering it seems like the vision has become to lean more into the gore aspect. Now
Well,
I don't know how much that is from director or from studio, but
yeah,
all in
I
all,
do
very
know that the creators, that being James Wan, Leigh Whannell, two big name. Well, James Wan in particular, huge name in horror because after this he goes on to direct like Insidious and I think The Conjuring and all that stuff. I think Leigh Whannell also goes off to do horror films, but I'm not as familiar. But I know they've talked about in interviews that like the whole thing where like it turns into gore movies or whatever, that was like not them. Like which makes sense because I don't think, I think it's more of a marketing push in this movie that made that the perception of it. It's not that, like, it is definitely supposed to feel grotesque and feel gross, but I think a lot of what you don't see, I think that I think its budget is part of it, but I think they were more like they knew what their budget was going in and conceptualized a movie that would work by not showing stuff. Kind of conventional idea in horror of like you don't show the monster. In this case, you don't show the gore or whatever, but it's nice to leave it up to the imagination. I think that was what they were going for. Right before we wrap it up, I wanted to comment on some technical aspects of this movie. So there is the color correction, which we mentioned. I think in this movie, it's pretty forgivable. There are even moments where I would say it works pretty well, but there are also definitely moments where I think it's a bit excessive. You get like, you get the piss filter, you get the matrix greens and stuff, and it's rare that you can look at that color correction and think it actually looks like how that environment would really look if you were there. But it is stylish and works decently well. I think there's some understanding of like how those colors are going to impact viewer experience, so it's not just like covering it in an ugly color just because everybody else is doing it. There is like more intention to it. Set design in the movie is really good, especially when you look at the bathroom. Like I think the whole design of that room is genius, and like it's the filth of the room that makes the movie feel grosser. So like even if you're not seeing things happening, you still feel kind of sick watching it just because of the way the room looks. But the main thing I wanted to comment on was that this is a big part of the this just being a more independent movie using like smaller actors, a first time director, but the acting in this movie is pretty bad, and there are some scenes where it is like almost unforgivably bad. And I think the worst thing is that I feel like two of the weaker performances you get are the people in the trap, particularly Dr. Gordon, who it just kind of seems like whether it was a fault of the directing, like not really knowing how to give him good direction, or just the casting, but he kind of just seems like he's never been in a movie before, and he gives a very lackluster performance. I would also say there are scenes like when the killer, quote unquote, is like kidnapping his family, and the family like breaks loose. There's this fight scene that breaks out, and it is just so bad. Like it looks like it came out of like a soap opera or something. The way everything unfolds and how it's shown, it's like I would probably chalk it up most likely to the directing. We have a first time director, we have a smaller budget. I don't think the cast is like bad or anything. I think there was just, maybe you learn how to direct actors over the course of a career. And I don't think that was all there yet. And that's something that, like, this movie wins me over through, I think, concept, and I think a lot of like stylistic decisions. Even some of those, like the editing, can be kind of obnoxious, but it feels like a pretty cool movie with some good intent behind it and some pretty effective scenes. But when I look at like a lot of the technical elements of the movie, it's pretty flawed. Though there is, on the flip side, there is a charm in that you can say like, "Ooh, I kind of like the amateur nature of this movie," especially compared to the later big budget movies, which also are very flawed, but much less forgivably so. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for. Like, if you really like watching like amateur kind of movies, then that stuff probably won't bother you. But I do think it's something that hurts the movie. Like, it could have been stronger.
I will ask, what were their accents supposed to be?
Right? I think Dr. Gordon has like five different accents over the course of the
Yeah,
movie.
yeah. Okay, well, anyway, I think we can wrap it up. For me, saw one pretty enjoyable film. I like the thrill of it. I'd like the concept. I'd like the mystery. Just all in all, a good watch. I'd probably give it mm, maybe like an 8, 7.5, or an 8. Just in general, a fun film and a good time, especially during the spooky season.
Yeah, I would give Saw a 6. I think that it's like better in concept than it is in execution, but it is an entertaining movie. Um, I would say that, easily the best of the franchise. Um, and it's one of those movies that doesn't feel like it was ever meant to be a franchise, and those, tend to be the best ones. Um, I would recommend the movie, I think. I mean, if you've never seen it, like, this is a pretty iconic movie of the 2000s, iconic horror film. Um, as for the rest of the movies, you can skip them unless you just want total schlock, in which case you'll probably love them. But this is actually a pretty smart movie. If you like thrillers, if you like movies with like really sharp writing twists and stuff, then this one's definitely pretty good. Um, and yeah, with that, I think we can get into what you recommended to me, Steven.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so last time I recommended to you a board game, a spooky board game called My Father's Work. It came out officially last year. It's a app-driven board game. The concept is you are a family lineage trying to complete your father's work. It takes place across 3 generations, so by the end it's your great grandfather's work, I guess, technically. And each generation plays over 3 rounds. So you'll play the early years, the middle years, and the late years, and as you go through the game, it kind of evolves with you as you make certain decisions. With that, I'll hand it over to you to talk about My Father's Work.
Yeah, so for reference, we got one game out of this. We were able to play a game of it, but the game lasted pretty long. Like, I think I was surprised seeing the structure being, ultimately 9 rounds, how long the game actually lasted. Each generation, which lasts 3 rounds each, feels like you could almost play an entire board game in that amount of time if it was something like Clue or something like that. Like, it doesn't it lasts longer than you would expect. I think a lot of that is because they pad it out with like story. So it's like when you hit certain events on the board, the game master will read from the story. We played this through Tabletop Sim, so I don't know. Like, I'm guessing, is there like a physical book it comes with, or like, is that in the instruction manual, or is it? Oh, it's the app.
Yeah, it's an app.
It's the app, right? You were using the app. I forgot that was just, that would be that way whether you were playing tabletop or not. Um, yeah, and so like you go in the app and you read the story alongside. I guess it changes depending on the decisions you make and the expansion that you play and things like that. You may have more information on that, but I thought that was a pretty like creative element, and that was sort of where the horror came in. It feels very like very old horror, like very like 1800s, early 1900s style of writing, focusing on like olden time kind of tales. We were doing a story that involved like witch trials and stuff, and the story was more about like the horror of the mob, the fear of like people um thinking you're a witch. And then like kind of the extra spook factor that like, well, we may not have been witches, but we were working on some spooky experiments that we didn't want anyone to find out about. I thought those things were fun. I mean, it definitely was a more unique board game in this, that from things that I've played, in the sense that like it kind of felt like you were actively participating in a story that you were creating, almost like a choose your own adventure style book or game. And that was pretty neat.
Yeah, and I think what's so great about that is that there are a lot of like natural emergent moments that come just via the concept. Like, I'll say, not in our particular game necessarily, but in one of the scenarios, there's kind of these secret societies, and one of those secret societies are essentially monster hunters. And it ended up, through gameplay, what happened was I was trying to complete my father's work, which was lycanthropy, and I was secretly on the Society of Werewolf Hunters. So there are fun little moments like that that kind of emerge just naturally because of the story concepts and what you're trying to do as a player.
When it came to the goal of the game, I think it's kind of just whatever you put into it. I mean, the ultimate goal revolves around victory points, similar to another board game we'd played, Lost Ruins of Arnak, and maybe another one as well. So it's like you have different paths and decisions to make each round as to like how you're going to achieve those, whether it's like gaining more cards, uh, or completing the experiments, which is the main thrust of the game. You're trying to complete enough so that you can have the prerequisites to complete your father's work, which is like this experiment that's you have the entire game, this experiment card, and it's very expensive and difficult to perform. But if you do, you get a lot of victory points. When it comes to who actually wins the game, it's whoever has the most victory points collected, and that comes from all of the things that you've done over the course of the game. Too much to even explain. Um, I think that in our playthrough, I was focused on that aspect of it and trying to achieve the victory points. But you could also very easily play this game not really caring about that, because I feel like of all the elements in the game, this was by far the least lore driven. Like, sure, completing experiments and gaining resources is what wins you the game, and that does tie into what's going on in the story, but it also like feels pretty disconnected, and there's no real mention of these victory points in the story. There, at least in our story, there was no like in-universe explanation for what those were. They were just a separate element to the game that came in after the fact. So you could very easily play this just trying to do things to get the story to go a way that you want. Um, and to try to like avoid the worst outcome in your own story. So you could play it like literally just like an interactive story experience too. And I think if I were to play this more, that would start to become my goal, just because I would get tired of the victory points element or tired of losing, which is usually what happens when I play board games.
Yeah, although I will say in our particular play, there was one small connection in universe where the victory points started to become renown, and you had like I forgot what they call it, but like your driving goal ended up being to become famous, and to become famous you needed to have more renown. So sometimes there's a slight tie, but I will agree with you. I think the victory point element is the weakest element of the game, and truthfully, whenever I play this, every time I played it with people at the table, like yeah, everyone's kind of like passively trying to win. But honestly, the fun is just the puzzle of it all and getting to experience doing things that advance the story in interesting ways. Because every time you play, it can be a little different. Now, I think one thing I'll say about the game, and I don't know how true this is or not, but I feel like there is a universe where you've played this so much that you know exactly like the straight line path to the exact ending that you want. I don't know if much of what happens really is that all that randomized, because it is based on like decisions that each of the players make. And maybe if that were to occur, that would get kind of samey. But I think each of the scenarios, and there's 3 scenarios that come with the game, each of them have something like 8 different possible endings. So there's a lot of ways that the game, like the game story, can branch, and it's fun to be able to experience all of that.
Yeah, I think for me, if I had to pick out things that were less impressive in the game, on the one play that I had, it would oddly be the thing that I said made it the most unique, which was that I I think the writing in the story was very good. It very like convincingly sounded like a really old horror story. And the story itself was fine. I had no problems with the writing or anything. I just felt like for me, and maybe this was just as a first time player, but I felt like this element of the game could be pretty interruptive. Like there were a lot of times where I actually did start to get kind of focused on the game itself and on the victory point element and on just playing it and trying to do things, that the fact that like a lot of times we would do something that would cause us to have to like wait for the whole story to be read. It's like I think that I just wasn't as invested in that side of it. So a lot of the times I'd just be like, okay, yeah, but I want to, I want to keep going. It was like compared to something like Arnak, for example, which is a similar, I'd say a similar genre of game in terms of like, you're getting resources, which you can then exhaust to achieve other things, gaining victory points. I don't know what you would call that genre of board game, but this is very much in the same league. But that game felt much more like it was just gameplay. Like you're just constantly playing and moving forward. Whereas this game, because of the whole interactive story element, it's a lot slower. And I didn't really like that slow pace too much because it did like there were so many things to focus on that like I kind of just wanted to sit there and strategize and do the work of the game and not like have to wait these extended periods of time to even like get to make my next decision. Especially when I said the game lasted a long time and it does, but we weren't counting how many turns we took, but I felt like each round there weren't a lot of turns you could take. Like you would run out of things to do pretty quick. And while there were opportunities to extend the amount of turns you could have per round, um, it felt to me like I wasn't like the game shouldn't have lasted that long considering how many options I actually had the whole time. Um, but somebody else might just see that as a benefit because the gameplay itself is fun enough, but a lot of people might come in and just like actually want to design their own story, so the fact that so much of the game can be taken up by those moments might be like a draw to somebody else. It was just something that I, as a first time player, started to get a little tired of.
I can see that. Although I will say, like the actual story and what you do and like just the look and feel of the game is so incredibly thematic that it's easy to just kind of get sucked into it in that regard, at least. Because everything you're doing is create like basically undertaking experiments to get more knowledge or ingredients so that way you can build up to your father's work. All the locations are very in that gothic style. All the writing, as you mentioned, is in that very like Frankenstein style, and even one of the father's works is like, a creature. So you can play it very much in that sense, and it fits very comfortably there. That alone to me carries this. And one thing that you didn't get to experience because we played on tabletop sim is all of the components are incredibly nice and detailed. They're all these nice, very wooden, like die cast pieces with like individually unique ingredients. So even though one of the ingredients, for instance, is like animals, there's like all these different animals that you can get or different coffin types and stuff that really help elevate it as well.
I think it's
So at
probably
least from that aspect, I think this game really carries a lot of weight.
yeah, I think it's something that maybe if we ever get the opportunity to play this tabletop in person, that would probably enhance my experience a lot. Like actually sitting there and reading the stories together with the pieces and with the board in front of you would probably make that thematic experience a lot more like well tied. It is difficult to judge the game having only played on tabletop sim because that was just how we could play it. Because it does feel like it's it being a group experience, playing it in the dark by candlelight or something. Like that would probably make this pretty sick. Um, there's no doubt about it. Like it's very thematic. Everything is pulled together really well. The art, the story, and the style of writing, and the cards, and everything like has a really strong theme that gives it that old timey horror aesthetic. Makes it feel like you're inside of a novel. All of that is done really well. I think like it just kind of came down to personal preference. Like with this style of game, like I kind of would have preferred to just be able to focus on my plays and stuff. Um, but that could just be a me thing. I don't think that the board game did anything wrong, really. If anything, like they did a lot to incorporate elements of the story into the board as much as they could, especially considering that they can't really predict super easily what players are going to do to change their own story and how it's going to evolve. And yet still, you never felt like it was going too off from what you were seeing in your cards on the board. And I mean that's like a really fine balancing act that I think the fact that they pulled that off is easy to appreciate.
Okay, so should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I'm fine to wrap it up. Uh Giving this final thoughts after one play feels extremely unfair. I will do it, but it comes with a big asterisk of Yeah, I played this once. Now again, one play was multiple hours, so it wasn't like I just casually ran through it or something. We got the full experience, or at least a decent amount of it, as much as you can get digitally. We got, but that asterisk is there. I think with that, I enjoyed this lightly, but I think I personally would have preferred, yeah, to just be able to sink more into the game side of it, which I felt like it's not like most of the time was spent reading stories. Most of it was spent playing, but I still felt like with the length of the game, I wish that I'd spent more of that length making decisions and strategizing versus listening to the story, which was, interesting and well written, but not really something that I got too sunk into. Um, so if I had to score the game on my one play of the game is the way I'll put it. I would go for like probably a 7. I think that the game side of it was extremely well done, and I did get really hooked on trying to achieve my father's work, which I did not. Actually, neither of us did on our play. Um, but like going for that and making those strategy decisions, like it was a really well-rounded game, and a lot of the things that were in there were really smart. Much like with Arnak, like there can be a certain like it can be a bit exhausting to play just because of how much you have to constantly be like thinking about and how little you actually get to do until later. Like it's a game where you're playing it for the long game. Again, much like Arnak, which we've talked about as well. And I think that can make the game tiresome and even somewhat tedious, but that really starts to pay off in late game. So I really didn't have a problem with anything as far as the game itself was concerned. I think I just again felt like it was kind of interruptive, but not in a way that ruined it for me. And I think I mean, I definitely recommend playing it in person. I haven't done that yet, but I want to. Like after having played it, I feel like if we're able to do that, I would like this a lot more. And I imagine if anyone has this or is able to get their hands on it, like playing this with like more than what you can have up to 4 players. Is that right? I
Yeah.
think that like that would probably be a really cool experience because you're all getting to like get involved in this story together, and the competition aspect, while it's there, it's not so overbearing that it would ruin friendships. So yeah, I think this was a pretty cool game, and I did like it.
For me, I personally give this one a 10. This has been one of my faves lately. I've played it a lot. I especially in this time of the month or time of the year, I should say. It's a perfect game to kind of round out the spooky board game plays. Like you mentioned, putting on some Halloween music in the background, sitting down with this, like it's just so thematic. I could see a really fun playthrough where you all kind of come dressed in like a more gothic style. I feel like that would be hilarious and really fun. For me, the actual experience of the game is just so interesting, like being able to kind of craft a story with others. And then the puzzle element of trying to get to your father's work is really fun. But like I said, I typically when I play it and everyone I've played it with, none of us are really playing to win. Like we're typically just playing to like you kind of craft your own win condition, I find in this game. And for most people that is I want to try to get to my father's work. And if you do that, oftentimes you win because you do get so many points for that. But honestly, the fact that at the end it's like, okay, now put your victory points, somebody wins, everyone's like, all right, cool, I guess. I'm sure if you play this with someone who's like hyper competitive, I think that this would not work well. You have to play this with the right group, I do believe. You have to play this with a group that's not super hyper competitive, that's, wants to kind of be in that theme and existing in that story for a few hours because that's really where I feel like the game shines, to be honest. But I definitely recommend it if you can play it. I mean, even on tabletop sim, it's still a fun play. You have to kind of get the app separately. They actually have it available via browser or it's a free app on the phone. And there are some situations where that can be a little clunky because there are some moments where you're supposed to like secretly pass the app to someone and they're supposed to read something without anyone else knowing. When I've played it on TTS and I even think in our play there may have been a moment like that or two, I typically just read it out loud. Kind of gets rid of some of the secrecy that can occur in some games, which is kind of fun. But for the most part, it doesn't really bog down the experience. But certainly, if you can play this at the table, I think it's a really great time.
Yeah, and I think with that we can say goodbye to our skeleton friends. Say goodbye to Billy.
Bye.
Say goodbye to
Bye.
Mallory's. Say goodbye to
Oh,
Ashley and Zoe.
old grinning gumshoes Gary, they used to call him back in the 20s when he was throwing that slider.
Still a skeleton even back then.
Yeah, kind of crazy. He couldn't do the spitball though, because he has no spit, unfortunately.
But God, can he throw a curveball?
Yep.
We'll see you around, Gary. We'll get to our recommendations as soon as we exit our immortal forms and return to our mortal vessels. And
Oh, there we go.
I
And now
will.
we're mortal.
Yep. Now I can die again and become a ghost again.
It's just that
Oh,
easy, everyone. If you're looking into it, just do like that.
yeah. Just will it into being, and it will be so. So for my recommendation, we are going to continue the Evangelion series and actually cap it off with the film The End of Evangelion. This film was released in 1997. It came about a year or more after the ending of the original series. The ending of the original series was so infamously hated is not necessarily the right word because I think some people really liked it, but a lot of the cultural fandom of Evangelion in Japan, which was a big deal when it was airing, uh, was very disappointed by it. The studio got a lot of death threats and terrible hate mail, which is actually featured in this film in points. Um, so this film was basically a remake of the last two episodes of the series. The same story beats are pretty much hit. The thing is though is that watching it, especially for the first time, you don't notice that because you and I know you didn't really understand what the story beats even were in the last two episodes, and most people didn't either until this movie kind of made it a little bit easier to understand. Um, And yeah, so obviously directed by Hideki Anno, much like the series, Studio Gainax still producing it. This movie also has the most unbelievably long crawl of company logos I've ever seen at the start of a movie. So there were a lot of people involved in this, making it a really big deal. I know the Japanese press made it a really big deal when this movie came out. It's structured in the form of two episodes, so there will be episode 25 and then credits, and then episode 26. Just kind of an odd format for a movie, but this was actually not the only film that was released. Prior to this, they released Evangelion Death and Rebirth, which I have not seen. I believe that it is a recap of the series and then culminates with part of the episode 25, which ends up in this movie. But I'm not saying that with total confidence because I have not watched it. Uh, so yeah, like it was very strongly built up to, made to be this really big deal, and did eventually become the end of the series until Hideki Anno revisited it with a series of films, like kind of remaking the series later. But we will not actually get to those. So this will end our Evangelion saga, and yeah, we'll check that out next time. What do you have for me, Steven?
Okay, so in honor of old gumshoes Gary, for next time, I'm recommending Mario Superstar Baseball. Mario Superstar Baseball is a 2005 game for the Nintendo GameCube. Kind of came at a time when there were a lot of Mario sports games being made. On the N64, you had golf and tennis, and then as you moved into the GameCube, they included baseball and I think some others. Basketball happened at one point. Mario's
Soccer.
played a lot of sports. Soccer, of course. How could I forget? Mario Strikers is great as well. But we're going to be talking about Mario Superstar Baseball. And I won't mention it on here, but I'll mention it after the fact. There is a secret special way to play Mario Superstar Baseball that will allow you and I to play against each other. And we can see who's the best batsman and who can throw the nastiest curve, just like old gumshoes.
Yeah, it is Gary. It is Gary.
Yeah, that's true. Well, yeah, I mean, we're not competing against Gary, we're competing against each other. There's no competition against Gary.
And yeah, that about does it for our 2023 Halloween episode. Of course, despite our yearly release schedule, we did feel that fitting in a Halloween episode as well would be nice. Um, having been ghosts for this entire year, it did
That's true. We
feel
did
thematic.
ghost our audience for a very long time.
Well,
So
now you know why. Now you know why.
yes, exactly. We were literal ghosts.
Um, yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know if you have anything left to add.
No, thanks for listening, everyone.
Yeah. And with that, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get wrecked.